under the endless starlit sky of the Arizona desert, where silence reigns and isolation is a way of life. A solitary cowboy named Jack Thornton lived his days tending to his small ranch, far from civilization's reach. For years, he'd chosen this existence. No neighbors, no questions, no complications. But on one fateful night, when a blinding light tore through the darkness and something crashed into the canyon behind his property, Jack's world would be forever altered. What he found among the wreckage wasn't a downed aircraft or a meteor. It was something impossibly alive, wounded, and utterly beyond human comprehension. As Jack made the split-second decision to help this mysterious being, he had no idea that by dawn, he would uncover a truth so profound it would shatter everything he believed about his past, his purpose, and the very nature of reality itself. This is the story of an unlikely encounter that bridged two worlds and revealed that some connections transcend the boundaries of species, planets, and time. Jack Thornton had lived alone for the better part of 15 years, and that's exactly how he preferred it. At 53, weathered by the desert sun and worn by a past he'd rather forget, he found solace in the predictable rhythm of ranch life. His days began before sunrise, tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing fences that seemed to break with stubborn regularity, and ensuring his horses had everything they needed. The nearest town, Redemption Falls, lay 40 miles to the east, far enough that Jack only made the journey once a month for supplies. The locals knew him as the quiet man who kept to himself, paid his bills in cash, and never stayed long enough for small talk. The ranch itself was modest, consisting of a weathered single-story house, a barn that had seen better days, and a few outbuildings scattered across 200 acres of scrubland. It wasn't much, but it was his sanctuary. After a career in the military that had taken him to places he couldn't speak about and shown him things he wished he could forget, Jack had retreated here to find peace. The desert demanded respect but asked no questions. The animals needed care but offered no judgment. It was a simple existence, and simplicity was all Jack wanted anymore. On the night that everything changed, Jack had just finished his evening routine. He'd fed the horses, checked on the cattle in the south pasture, and returned to his house as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Dinner was the same as always: canned beans, bread, and coffee, so strong it could strip paint. He ate on his front porch, listening to the desert come alive with the sounds of evening. Coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through the creosote bushes, the occasional cry of a nighthawk overhead. Around 10 o'clock, Jack was preparing for bed when he heard a sound unlike anything he'd experienced before. It started as a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet, growing steadily louder until it became a deafening roar. Jack rushed outside just in time to see something streak across the sky, trailing fire and leaving a scar of light across the darkness. Whatever it wasn't an airplane or a helicopter. It moved with impossible speed and made no sound like any aircraft he'd ever encountered during his military years. The object, and Jack had no better word for it, seemed to struggle, zigzagging violently as if fighting for control. Then, with a final burst of light that illuminated the entire ranch as bright as noon, it disappeared beyond the ridge that marked the western boundary of his property. A few seconds later, Jack felt more than heard a tremendous impact that sent a shudder through the earth and spooked his horses into frightened neighing. For a long moment, Jack stood frozen on his porch, his mind racing through possibilities. A plane crash? Some kind of military test gone wrong? His instincts, honed by years in special operations, told him this was something different, something unprecedented. The rational part of his brain urged him to call the authorities, to report what he'd seen and let someone else handle it. But another part, the part that had been drawn to the unknown throughout his military career, the part that had made him volunteer for the most dangerous missions, pushed him toward the source of that impact. Jack went back inside and grabbed his rifle, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. If someone had crashed, they'd need help. And out here, help was a long time coming unless you provided it yourself. He saddled up Ranger, his most reliable horse, and set out across the darkened landscape toward the ridge. The moon provided just enough light to navigate, and Ranger seemed to sense his urgency, moving with steady determination despite his earlier fright. The ride to the crash site took 20 minutes, and as Jack crested the ridge, he saw the glow before he saw anything else. A strange, pulsating blue-green light emanating from the canyon below. He dismounted and proceeded on foot, leading Ranger carefully down the rocky slope. The closer he got, the more his skin tingled with an odd sensation, like static electricity building in the air. The temperature seemed wrong, too, alternating between pockets of intense heat and unusual cold. When Jack finally reached the source of the light, his breath caught in his throat. Embedded in the canyon floor was something that could only be described as a craft, but unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen. It was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet in diameter, with a surface that seemed to shift and shimmer like liquid metal. Parts of it were clearly damaged, with torn sections revealing an interior that glowed with that eerie blue-green light. Debris was scattered around the impact crater, some pieces still smoking, others emanating that same otherworldly luminescence. But it was the figure lying near the wreckage that made Jack's heart pound. At first glance, it appeared humanoid: 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, and a head. But that's where the similarities ended. The being was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to possess an opalescent quality, shifting between shades of silver and pale blue in the pulsating light. It wore what might have been a suit, or perhaps was its actual skin. Jack couldn't tell. What he could see clearly was the dark substance seeping from a wound in the being's side, and the labored rise and fall of its chest. Jack's military training kicked in, overriding his shock. Injured meant alive, and alive meant he had a choice to make. Every instinct screamed that this was beyond anything he should handle alone, that this was a matter for government agencies with resources and expertise he couldn't imagine. But as he stood there, watching this impossible being struggle for each breath, Jack thought about all the times he'd been the one lying wounded, hoping someone would make the choice to help rather than abandon him. He approached slowly, rifle ready but pointed down. As he got closer, the being's eyes opened large, luminous eyes that held an intelligence and depth that was unmistakably conscious, unmistakably aware. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, 2 beings from impossibly different worlds, connected by the universal language of suffering and the hope for mercy. The being made no move to attack, showed no signs of aggression. Instead, those eyes held something Jack recognized from his own mirror pain: fear and a desperate will to survive. That look decided it for Jack. He knelt beside the being and carefully examined the wound, his medic training from his military days guiding his actions. The anatomy was different, certainly, but the basics of trauma care were universal: stop the bleeding, prevent shock, stabilize the patient. Using supplies from his first aid kit and strips torn from his shirt, Jack worked to dress the wound. The being watched him throughout, never flinching, seeming to understand that Jack was trying to help. Getting the injured alien back to the ranch proved to be one of the most challenging things Jack had ever attempted. The being was surprisingly light for its size, but its tall frame made maneuvering difficult, especially on the rocky terrain. Jack couldn't risk using Ranger. The horse was already skittish from the crash and the strange scent of the alien. Instead, he fashioned a makeshift travois from branches and rope he'd brought in his saddlebag, carefully positioning the being on it before beginning the slow, arduous journey back. The trek took over an hour, and by the time Jack reached his barn, the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern sky. He decided against bringing the being into his house. Too many windows, too much visibility if anyone happened to come by. The barn offered privacy and could be secured from the inside. He cleared out one of the larger horse stalls, laying down fresh hay and blankets to create a comfortable space. The alien remained conscious throughout, but seemed to be growing weaker, its breathing more labored. Jack knew his basic first aid wouldn't be enough, but what could he do? It wasn't like he could take the being to Redemption Falls General Hospital. Even if he wanted to, even if it were the right thing to do, the implications were staggering. His mind kept circling back to stories he'd heard during his military service, whispered rumors about recovered craft, about government facilities where unknown things were taken, about people who asked too many questions, disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. Jack had always dismissed such talk as paranoid fantasy, but standing in his barn with living proof that humanity wasn't alone in the universe, those stories suddenly seemed a lot less far-fetched. As daylight strengthened, Jack examined the wound more carefully. The dark fluid blood, he assumed, had slowed but not stopped entirely. The being's ass skin around the injury had taken on a grayish tint that Jack instinctively knew wasn't good. He needed to do something more, but what? His medical kit was designed for humans, for familiar biology. Everything about this being was unknown territory. Then, surprisingly, the alien moved. Its long arm reached out, pointing toward the south, toward the direction of the crash site. At first, Jack didn't understand, but the being repeated the gesture, more insistently this time. Those large eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that seemed to communicate across the barrier of species and language. It wanted something from the crash site, something important. Jack hesitated. Daylight meant visibility, and returning to the crash site meant risk. But if there were something there that could help this being survive, didn't he have an obligation to try? He'd already committed to helping. Turning back now felt like betrayal. Jack secured the barn, made sure the being had water within reach, though he had no idea if it could even drink water, and headed back out to Ranger. The ride to the canyon in daylight revealed details he'd missed in darkness. The impact had been enormous, leaving a crater at least 50 feet across. Pieces of the craft were scattered over a wide area, some buried in the ground, others caught in the scraggly desert vegetation. In the morning light, the wreckage looked even more impossible, materials that shouldn't exist, surfaces that seemed to defy physics, technology that made human engineering look primitive by comparison. Jack searched the area methodically, looking for anything that might be what the alien wanted. He found strange devices, fragments of what might have been equipment, and pieces of the craft itself. Finally, near what appeared to have been the control area of the vessel, he found a container roughly cylindrical, about the size of a coffee thermos, with a surface that pulsed with a soft internal light. When Jack picked it up, it was surprisingly warm and seemed to vibrate gently in his hands. This had to be it. But as Jack secured the container in his saddlebag, he heard something that sent ice through his veins, the distant sound of vehicles, multiple engines, coming from the direction of his ranch. He'd been too focused on his search to pay attention to time, and now he realized he'd been gone for nearly 2 hours. Someone had noticed the crash, someone had come to investigate, and they were at his property. Jack urged Ranger into a gallop, racing back across the desert. As he crested the ridge that overlooked his ranch, his worst fears were confirmed. 3 black SUVs were parked in his front yard, and men in dark suits were moving around his property with purposeful efficiency. 2 of them were heading toward the barn. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. He'd been in the military long enough to recognize a government operation when he saw one. These weren't local sheriff's deputies. These were federal agents, probably from some agency whose acronym most people had never heard. He circled wide, approaching his property from the back, using the terrain and vegetation for cover. Rangers seemed to sense the need for stealth, moving quietly despite his fatigue. Jack dismounted about 100 yards from the barn and approached on foot, keeping low. He could hear voices, now efficient, professional tones of people doing a job. They were searching his property, looking for any sign of the crash or its occupant. "Nothing in the house," one voice called out. "No signs of unusual activity. No evidence he's seen anything. Check the barn and outbuildings." Another voice responded deeper, carrying authority. "The trajectory analysis puts the object down within a 5-mile radius of this location. If anything survived, it would have looked for shelter." Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let them find the alien instinct told him there would be a death sentence for the being, or worse, a life of captivity and experimentation. But how could he stop them? He was one man against what looked like a dozen trained agents. Then he remembered the old smuggler's tunnel, a relic from Prohibition days when the ranch had been used for running bootleg whiskey. The entrance was concealed in the barn's tack room, and it led to an exit nearly a quarter-mile away in a dried creek bed. Jack had to act fast. He worked his way around to the barn's back wall, where a loose board he'd never bothered to fix properly offered access. He squeezed through just as he heard the barn's main doors being opened. Moving as silently as possible, Jack reached the stall where he'd left the alien. The being's eyes found his immediately, and Jack was struck by how much intelligence and understanding he saw there. Without words, the alien seemed to grasp the danger. Jack helped the being to its feet, a difficult process given the injury and the difference in their sizes. The alien was weak, leaning heavily on Jack as they made their way to the tack room. Behind them, Jack could hear the agents systematically searching the barn, moving from stall to stall. They had maybe a minute, if that. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall of shelving. Jack had to practically carry the alien through the narrow opening, and every second felt like an hour. The being's breathing was ragged, each movement clearly causing pain, but it made no sound that might give them away. As Jack pulled the concealed door close behind them, he heard an agent enter the tack room above. The tunnel was dark, cramped, and had the musty smell of decades of disuse. Jack had a small flashlight, but he didn't dare use it until they moved further from the entrance. He guided the alien through the darkness by touch and memory, one hand supporting the being, the other feeling along the earthen wall. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, and Jack could feel the alien growing heavier as its strength faded. Finally, they reached the exit, a wooden hatch concealed by brush in the creek bed. Jack carefully opened it, checking to ensure no agents were nearby. The coast was clear. He helped the alien out into the relative openness of the creek bed, then closed the hatch behind them. They were temporarily safe, but Jack knew it wouldn't last. The agents would eventually search the house thoroughly, find evidence of the tunnel, and follow their trail. As Jack caught his breath, supporting the alien against the creek bank, he pulled out the container he'd retrieved from the crash site. The alien's eyes brightened at the sight of it, and those long fingers reached for it with something that looked like desperate hope. Jack handed it over and watched as the being manipulated the surface in ways he couldn't quite follow. The container opened, revealing a viscous, luminescent substance inside. Without hesitation, the alien applied the substance directly to its wound. The effect was immediate and astounding. The gray discoloration began to fade. The wound started to close, and the being's breathing eased. Within minutes, what had been a potentially fatal injury looked merely serious. The alien looked at Jack with those profound eyes, and though no words were spoken, Jack felt a connection form in that moment, a bond forged by trust, risk, and shared survival against the odds. Jack knew they couldn't stay in the creek bed. The agents would expand their search radius, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. But the alien, while improved from the medical treatment, still wasn't strong enough to move quickly or far. They needed a hiding place, somewhere the agents wouldn't think to look, somewhere Jack could buy them enough time to figure out what to do next. Then Jack remembered the old Henderson place, an abandoned homestead about 3 miles northwest of his ranch. The family had left during the Dust Bowl era, and the property had sat empty for decades. The house had collapsed years ago, but the root cellar was built into a hillside and was likely still intact. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. The journey was grueling. Jack, half carried, half dragged the alien through ravines and washes, using every bit of cover the landscape offered. He could hear helicopters in the distance. Now the search was intensifying. Twice they had to freeze and hide as vehicles passed on distant roads. The alien never complained, never slowed their progress, showing a determination that Jack deeply respected. Despite coming from worlds apart, they were both survivors, both fighters who refused to give up. When they finally reached the Henderson place, Jack's arms were burning with fatigue and his shirt was soaked with sweat. The root cellar was right where he remembered it, a heavy wooden door set into the hillside, partially concealed by decades of accumulated brush and soil. Jack cleared the entrance and pulled the door open, revealing a dark space that smelled of earth and time. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter, and right now, that was everything. Jack helped the alien inside, then gathered some of the dried brush to partially reconceal the entrance before following. In the darkness of the cellar, Jack finally allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. Next to him, he could hear the alien's breathing, steadier now but still labored. They sat in silence for a long time, two beings from different worlds sharing the simple relief of temporary safety. Then something extraordinary happened. The alien spoke, not in words that Jack could understand, but in his mind images and feelings that communicated more directly than language ever could. Jack saw glimpses of a world he couldn't name, beautiful and terrible in its alienness. He felt the being's purpose, its mission. It was a scout, an explorer seeking knowledge of other worlds. He sensed the accident, the equipment failure that had sent the craft spiraling toward Earth. And most powerfully, he felt the alien's gratitude and growing trust toward him. Jack tried to reciprocate, opening his mind to share his own story. He thought about his life, his time in the military, the things he'd seen and done that had driven him to seek isolation in the desert. He shared his fear of what the government agents would do if they captured the alien, based on stories he'd heard and the general human tendency to fear and control what they did not understand. The mental connection was imperfect, fragmented, but profound in its intimacy. Through this exchange, Jack learned the being's name, not a word exactly, but a concept that Jack's mind translated roughly as Meridian. In return, Meridian understood Jack, not just as a name, but as an identity forged by experiences, choices, and a fundamental decency that transcended species. In those moments of connection, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in his 15 years of isolation, genuine companionship, but their respite was short-lived. As the day wore on, Jack knew he had to return to his ranch, had to face the agents and deflect their suspicions. If he stayed away too long, if he disappeared, they would intensify their search and likely find both him and Meridian. He had to play the role of the ignorant cowboy who'd slept through whatever had happened, who knew nothing and cared less about government business. Before leaving, Jack made Meridian as comfortable as possible. He left water, some food, though he had no idea if the alien could eat human food, and promised to return after dark. Meridian's eyes conveyed understanding, and Jack felt through their mental link a sense of trust that made his chest tighten with responsibility. This being was depending on him, and Jack was determined not to fail. The walk back to his ranch felt longer than the desperate flight away from it. Jack deliberately took his time, practicing his story, making sure his expression showed nothing but mild confusion about why government agents might be interested in his property. He approached openly, making no attempt at stealth, playing the part of a man returning from a day of checking his cattle. The agents spotted him immediately, and within seconds, Jack found himself surrounded by serious men in dark suits. The one in charge, a tall man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone used to being obeyed, stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton? I'm Special Agent Morrison. We need to ask you some questions about last night." Jack kept his expression neutral, channeling the taciturn cowboy persona he'd cultivated over the years. "What about last night? Did you see or hear anything unusual? Any lights in the sky? Any impacts or explosions?" Jack pretended to think about it, then shook his head. "I go to bed early, Agent Morrison. Usually asleep by 9. Didn't hear anything unusual." It was a calculated risk. If they had evidence he'd been up later, his lie would be obvious. But Jack was betting they didn't. Morrison studied him for a long moment, and Jack could see the agent weighing his words, looking for tells that would indicate deception. "You didn't see a bright light around 10 p.m.? Your horses weren't disturbed. Horses spook at coyotes all the time. Wouldn't know if last night was any different." Jack kept his body language relaxed, his tone bored. "Look, Agent Morrison, I don't know what this is about, and frankly, I don't want to know. I keep to myself, mind my own business, and expect others to do the same. If something happened on government land or involving government business, that's not my concern." It was exactly the right tone, the dismissive indifference of someone who learned not to ask questions or get involved. Morrison's expression showed disappointment but also a grudging acceptance. There were millions of people like Jack in rural America, people who viewed government with suspicion and wouldn't cooperate beyond the bare minimum, even if they had information. "We'll need to search your property more thoroughly," Morrison said, but his tone had shifted, slightly less suspicious, more procedural. Jack shrugged. "Got a warrant?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "We can get one. Then come back when you have it. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you and your men would leave my property." Jack's tone was polite but firm, the voice of a man who knew his rights and wouldn't be pushed around. For a tense moment, Jack thought Morrison might press the issue, might decide to search anyway and deal with the legal consequences later. But finally, the agent nodded curtly and signaled his men. "We'll be back, Mr. Thornton, and if we find out you're lying, that you're hiding anything, you'll face federal charges that will make your life very difficult." Jack just stared at him, saying nothing, his face a mask of stone. It was the same face he'd used countless times in the military when dealing with officers he didn't like, respectful enough to avoid insubordination, blank enough to reveal nothing. Morrison held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked to his SUV. Within minutes, the vehicles were driving away, leaving trails of dust in their wake. Only after they were gone, after Jack had watched until the dust settled and silence returned to his ranch, could he allow himself to breathe fully. That had been close too close. They hadn't found Meridian, but they hadn't given up either. Morrison would be back, and next time he'd have legal authority to tear the place apart. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the desert sky, Jack gathered supplies and set out once more for the Henderson place. He brought food, water, blankets, and a battery-powered lantern. When he opened the root cellar door, Meridian's eyes reflected the starlight, and Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. They'd survived the day, but the real challenges were just beginning. That night, sitting in the root cellar with Meridian, Jack made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He couldn't keep the alien hidden indefinitely. Morrison and his people would eventually find them. But maybe, just maybe, Jack could buy enough time for Meridian to recover fully and find a way home. It would mean risk, sacrifice, and potentially throwing away the quiet life he'd built. But as he looked at this being from another world, this unlikely companion who'd somehow become someone worth protecting, Jack knew he'd already made his choice back in that canyon when he decided to help rather than walk away. The next 3 days became a careful dance of deception and survival. Jack maintained his normal routine on the ranch, while secretly making trips to the Henderson place to care for Meridian. The alien was healing remarkably fast, thanks to the medical treatment from the salvaged container, but was still too weak to attempt anything more than short walks around the root cellar. Through their growing mental connection, Meridian had communicated that the healing substance would work better in sunlight. Apparently, Meridian's species could photosynthesize to some degree, converting light into energy that accelerated their biological processes. This created a dangerous dilemma. The root cellar offered safety, but no sunlight. Jack needed to find a way to give Meridian access to light without exposing them to the aerial surveillance that had become constant over the area. Helicopters passed over several times a day, and Jack had spotted what he was certain were drones making systematic grid patterns across the desert. Morrison wasn't taking any chances. The solution came from an unlikely source: Jack's knowledge of the area's geography. About a mile from the Henderson place was a narrow canyon with walls that rose nearly 60 feet on either side. The canyon ran east-west, meaning that for a few hours each day, sunlight would reach the canyon floor, while the high walls would block any aerial view from helicopters or drones flying at standard altitudes. It was risky, but if they timed it right, it might work. Jack began scouting the route, memorizing every rock and bush that could provide cover, calculating the exact times when sunlight would be optimal while aerial surveillance would be minimal. He watched the patterns of the helicopters and drones, noting that they seemed to decrease activity during the late morning hours, probably when crews were rotating or refueling. That would be their window. On the fourth day, Jack helped Meridian make the journey to the canyon. The alien was stronger now, able to walk with only minimal support, though the wound still showed signs of trauma. When they reached the canyon floor and Meridian stood in direct sunlight for the first time since the crash, Jack witnessed something extraordinary. The alien's skin began to shimmer with an inner light, colors dancing across the opalescent surface like aurora borealis. Meridian's entire body seemed to drink in the sunshine, and Jack could see the visible relaxation of pain, the easing of tension that had been present since their first meeting. They stayed for 2 hours, Jack keeping watch while Meridian absorbed the healing light. During this time, their mental connection deepened, and Jack learned more about Meridian's world and mission. The alien came from a species that had been exploring space for millennia, studying other worlds and civilizations with a philosophy of observation without interference. They had watched humanity for generations, fascinated by the species' capacity for both creation and destruction, always wondering if humans would ultimately choose wisdom or annihilation. Meridian's mission had been a standard survey, updating information about Earth's current state when the equipment failure occurred. The crash had been purely accidental, not part of any planned contact or invasion. In fact, Meridian's people had strict protocols about avoiding detection, which made the current situation particularly troubling. If the human authorities captured Meridian, it wouldn't just be one individual at risk. It could trigger a larger crisis between species, potentially leading to conflict neither side wanted or was prepared for. Jack found himself thinking about the implications of everything Meridian shared. Humanity wasn't alone, had never been alone, but had been carefully observed from a distance, like children being watched by concerned parents. Part of Jack felt resentful of this surveillance, this judgment from beings who considered themselves more advanced. But another part understood it. Humans had barely avoided destroying themselves multiple times in the past century alone. Maybe they weren't ready for contact with alien civilizations. Maybe they needed more time to grow up as a species. But the most significant revelation came when Meridian shared something personal, a memory that made Jack understand why the alien trusted him so completely. Meridian showed Jack images of another time, another crash, generations ago, when one of Meridian's ancestors had been found by a human in similar circumstances. That human had also chosen to help rather than exploit, had protected the alien until rescue could arrive, and had kept a secret for the rest of their life. Meridian's people had never forgotten that act of compassion, that proof that humans were capable of seeing past fear and self-interest to recognize the universal value of life. That ancient act of kindness had become part of Meridian's cultural memory, a story passed down through generations as evidence that humans, despite their flaws, possessed a fundamental decency that made them worth watching over, worth hoping for. And now, in helping Meridian, Jack had proven that this quality still existed, that the thread of compassion still ran through humanity's complex tapestry. The mental connection went both ways, and Jack found himself sharing things with Meridian that he'd never spoken about to anyone. He shared memories of his time in the military, of missions that had gone wrong, of soldiers under his command who died because of decisions he'd made. He shared the guilt that had driven him into isolation, the belief that he didn't deserve connection or community after the failures he'd presided over. He showed Meridian the walls he'd built around himself, the deliberate loneliness he'd chosen as a form of penance. What Meridian reflected back to Jack was compassion without judgment. The alien showed him that carrying guilt was human, but allowing it to destroy all possibility of future connection was a waste of the life he'd been given. Meridian's people understood loss. They lived for centuries, long enough to accumulate deep sorrows. But they also understood that life's value came from connection, from the choices made in each moment to either build or destroy, to help or harm, to open or close oneself to others. It was a simple message, but it hit Jack with profound force. For 15 years, he'd been punishing himself by avoiding anything that might lead to caring about someone or having someone care about him. He'd convinced himself this was noble, a way of protecting others from the damaged person he'd become. But Meridian helped him see it differently. His isolation wasn't protecting anyone. It was just another form of giving up, of letting old failures define all future possibilities. As they returned to the root cellar that afternoon, Jack felt something shift inside him. He didn't have words for it, but it was like a frozen part of his heart had begun to thaw. This alien, this impossible being from another world, had somehow reached the parts of himself he'd locked away and shown him they weren't as broken as he'd believed. But that evening brought new complications. Jack was doing his evening rounds on the ranch when he noticed a vehicle approaching, not one of the black SUVs, but a dusty pickup truck he recognized. Sarah Mitchell, his nearest neighbor despite living 15 miles away, pulled up to his house. Sarah was in her 60s, a widow who'd been running her own ranch since her husband passed 5 years ago. She and Jack had a cordial relationship based on mutual respect for each other's privacy and the occasional traded favor. "Jack," Sarah called out, climbing from her truck with the stiffness of someone who'd spent the day working hard. "Wanted to check on you. Those government folks came by my place asking questions about you, about whether I'd seen anything unusual on your property." Jack's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What did you tell them?" "Told them you were the most boring neighbor a woman could ask for," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Said the most unusual thing about you was that you actually fixed your fences instead of letting your cattle roam onto other people's land." But Jack ... her expression grew serious. "What's really going on?" Those weren't regular agents. They had the look of people who deal with things the rest of us aren't supposed to know about. Jack had to make a quick decision. He could lie to Sarah, maintain his story of ignorance, and hope she believed him. Or he could trust her, not with the whole truth, but with enough to ensure her silence if the agents came back. Sarah had always struck him as someone who understood the value of minding one's own business, but she also had a streak of stubborn independence that made her distrust government overreach. "Sarah," Jack said carefully, "there are some things happening that I can't talk about. Not because I don't trust you, but because knowing might put you at risk. What I can tell you is that if those agents come back, the best thing you can do for both of us is stick to your story, that I'm boring, predictable, and mind my own business." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes reading things in his face that Jack wished he could hide better. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You're protecting something. Or someone. And whatever it is, you think it's worth going up against federal agents for." She paused, then added, "Your business is your business, Jack. But if you need help, if things get complicated, my door's open. Not asking questions, just offering." Sometimes a person needs to know they're not completely alone, even if they prefer to be most of the time. The simple offer hit Jack harder than he expected. He'd spent so long avoiding exactly this kind of connection, this kind of caring, and now here it was, offered freely with no strings attached. "Thank you, Sarah," he managed to say. "I appreciate that more than you know." After Sarah left, Jack sat on his porch as darkness gathered, thinking about the tangled web his life had become. He was harboring an alien, lying to federal agents, and now potentially putting his neighbor at risk simply by association. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to contact Morrison, tell him everything, and let the government handle the situation. Meridian would likely be captured, studied, possibly imprisoned, but Jack would be clear of all legal jeopardy. But as Jack sat there under the emerging stars, thinking about Meridian's trust, about the ancient story of human compassion that had been passed down through an alien culture, about Sarah's simple offer of help, despite not knowing what she was offering to help with, he knew he couldn't make that choice. He'd spent 15 years running from connection, from responsibility, from the possibility of failing someone again. But sometimes running was its own form of failure. Sometimes the only way forward was to stand your ground, to choose to protect what mattered, even when the cost might be everything you had left. The breakthrough came on the 7th night after the crash. Jack had fallen into an exhausted sleep in the root cellar, sitting against the earthen wall while keeping watch over Meridian. He was pulled from dreams by a sensation he'd never experienced before, urgent pulse of thought that was in his own, filled with both excitement and trepidation. Meridian was fully awake, the alien's large eyes luminous in the darkness, and through their mental link, Jack felt a cascade of information flowing toward him. Meridian had been working on something during the hours. Jack was away at the ranch using salvaged technology from the medical container to construct a makeshift communication device. The alien species had protocols for exactly this kind of situation. Emergency procedures that would alert rescue operations to a stranded explorer's location. But there was a complication that made Jack's heart sink even as hope surged through their connection. The signal would work, but it would take time for a rescue craft to reach Earth, approximately 72 hours from the moment of transmission. And the signal itself, while designed to be undetectable by most technology, would likely register on the most sensitive military equipment as an anomaly, a burst of energy that didn't match any known signature. Morrison and his team would know immediately that something had happened, and they would triangulate the source. The rescue ship would arrive in 3 days, but the government agents would converge on their location within hours. Jack processed this information, understanding immediately what it meant. They would have to run, to stay ahead of Morrison search teams for 3 full days while protecting Meridian until the rescue arrived. It would mean abandoning his ranch, possibly forever. It would mean giving up the life he'd built, the sanctuary he'd created. Everything he'd used to insulate himself from the world would have to be left behind. Through their mental connection, Meridian offered him an out. The alien could send the signal alone, could lead Morrison's team away from Jack, could take full responsibility and spare the human from any consequences. It was generous, noble even, but Jack could also sense the fear beneath the offer, fear not of capture exactly, but of what humanity might do with the knowledge and technology Meridian's capture would provide. If humans weren't ready for contact, if they responded with fear and aggression rather than curiosity and wisdom, it could set in motion events that would echo across galaxies. "No," Jack said aloud, the word firm in the darkness. "We do this together. We run together, and we make sure you get home safely." That's how this ends. Meridian's response was wordless, but profound. A wave of gratitude mixed with something that felt remarkably like friendship. In just 7 days, two beings from impossibly different worlds had formed a bond that transcended the barriers of species, language, and understanding. They had become, in the most fundamental sense, allies committed to each other's survival. They activated the signal at midnight, the device emitting a pulse that Jack couldn't see or hear, but that Meridian assured him was now traveling through space at speeds beyond human comprehension. The moment it was done, they began to run. Jack had planned their route carefully over the previous days, mapping out a path through the most rugged and inaccessible parts of the desert canyons where vehicles couldn't follow. Rock formations that would mask their heat signatures from thermal imaging caves, where they could shelter during the day when helicopters would be searching. The first day was brutal. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness, Jack carrying the few supplies he'd managed to gather: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and his rifle. Meridian was much stronger, now able to move quickly despite the still healing injury. And Jack was grateful for his own military training that had taught him how to navigate by starlight and move across hostile terrain without leaving obvious trails. By dawn, they'd covered nearly 15 miles, reaching a canyon system Jack had explored during his early years at the ranch. They took shelter in a cave whose entrance was concealed by a rockfall, and Jack risked a brief scout of their surroundings. He could already see the helicopter activity intensifying in the distance, centered around the area where they'd sent the signal. Morrison would know something had happened, and the hunt would begin in earnest. As they rested during the day, Jack used the time to strengthen their connection. Meridian taught him techniques for mental communication that made their exchanges clearer, more precise. Jack learned that Meridian species didn't just share thoughts, they could share experiences, emotions, even sensory perceptions. When Meridian showed Jack what the stars looked like from the aliens' homeworld, Jack actually saw them, felt the aliens' childhood wonder at the cosmos spread out in unfamiliar constellations. In return, Jack shared his own memories of Earth's beauty sunrises over the desert, the sound of rain on the ranch house roof, the simple pleasure of coffee on a cold morning. He shared human music, the way it could move the soul without words, and was surprised to sense Meridian's deep appreciation. The alien species had something similar, patterns of vibration that conveyed meaning and emotion. And in that moment, Jack understood that for all their differences, both species had found ways to express the inexpressible, to create beauty from the raw materials of their worlds. But their respite was short-lived. By afternoon, Jack could hear vehicles in the distance, and twice helicopters passed close enough that they had to retreat deeper into the cave to avoid detection. Morrison's team was expanding their search radius, using every resource at their disposal. Jack overheard radio chatter from a scanner he'd brought. They were bringing in additional personnel, specialized tracking teams, even considering satellite surveillance. The government was taking this seriously, committing resources that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. That night, they moved again, pushing deeper into the wilderness. Jack's plan was to reach an area called the Broken Lands, a region where ancient tectonic activity had created a landscape so fractured and maze-like that even experienced hikers regularly got lost. It was dangerous terrain, but it would make systematic searching nearly impossible. If they could reach the Broken Lands and hide there for the remaining 2 days, they might actually pull this off. But as they traveled through the darkness of the second night, disaster struck. Jack, focused on the path ahead and checking for pursuit behind them, failed to notice a hidden wash until he'd already stepped into it. His ankle twisted violently, and he went down hard, biting back a cry of pain. Meridian was at his side instantly, those long fingers examining the injury with surprising gentleness. The ankle wasn't broken. Jack's military training gave him enough medical knowledge to assess that, but it was badly sprained, already swelling, and would make traveling at their previous pace impossible. Jack tried to stand, to push through the pain, but even he had to admit he couldn't maintain their current speed. They were still a full night's travel from the broken lands, and now he'd become the liability, the one slowing them down. Meridian's thoughts flowed into Jack's mind, not words, but intent. The alien wanted to carry him, to support his weight the way Jack had done for Meridian after the crash. It was a complete reversal of their initial roles, and something about it felt profoundly right. They had saved each other, first Jack rescuing Meridian from the crash site, and now Meridian refusing to leave Jack behind despite his injury. They continued through the night, slower now, with Jack leaning heavily on Meridian for support. The alien's strength surprised Jack despite the slender frame. Meridian could bear Jack's weight without seeming overly burdened. Through their connection, Jack could sense the alien's determination, the absolute refusal to abandon this human who had risked everything to help. Dawn found them still short of the broken lands, sheltering in a cluster of boulders that offered minimal concealment. Jack knew their situation was critical. The helicopters would be out with first light, and without the cover of the canyon system or the confusion of the broken lands, they would be vulnerable. He tried to stand to test his ankle, but the pain was immediate and sharp. He wasn't going anywhere fast, not without help. It was then that Meridian did something unexpected. The alien placed both hands on Jack's ankle, and Jack felt a warmth spreading through the injury, the same kind of healing energy that had sealed Meridian's wound. It wasn't as effective on human physiology, the biology was too different, but it helped, reducing the swelling and numbing the worst of the pain. It wouldn't heal the sprain completely, but it would allow Jack to move, to keep going despite the injury. Why? Jack asked aloud, though he could have thought the question. Why risk using your energy on me when you need it for yourself? Meridian's response came through their link, not in words, but in a concept so pure and simple it needed no translation. Because you are worth saving. Because in all the worlds Meridian had seen, in all the species encountered, acts of selfless compassion were the rarest and most precious things in the universe. Because Jack had proven himself to be someone worth protecting, worth risking for, worth calling friend. The word friend resonated through their connection with layers of meaning that went beyond human understanding. In Meridian's culture, friendship wasn't a casual term. It was a bond of profound significance, a recognition of souls that had connected across the void of difference to find common ground. By calling Jack friend, Meridian was acknowledging something that would be remembered, recorded in the aliens' people's vast history as a moment of true interspecies connection. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red, Jack and Meridian prepared to make their final push toward the broken lands. They had 36 hours left until the rescue ship arrived, and Morrison's teams were closing in from multiple directions. The odds of making it were slim, the chances of being captured high, but neither of them were giving up. Jack had spent 15 years in isolation, convincing himself he was better off alone. That connection only led to loss and pain. But in these desperate days with Meridian, he'd rediscovered something he thought he'd lost forever. The knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, that some connections were worth any risk, that sometimes the meaning of life was found not in safety or solitude, but in standing beside someone who needed you, regardless of the cost. As they set out across the open desert toward the broken lands, Jack realized that whatever happened next, whatever price he had to pay for his choices, he would pay it gladly. He had found something in this impossible friendship that was worth more than his comfortable isolation, more than his carefully constructed walls, more than even his freedom. He had found purpose again, and it felt like coming home. The broken lands lived up to their name. The landscape was a chaos of fractured rock, narrow canyons that dead-ended without warning, and vertical formations that seemed to defy geology itself. Jack and Meridian reached the outer edges by mid-morning of the second day, with helicopters circling in the distance and the sound of vehicles echoing off the rock walls behind them. They disappeared into the labyrinth just as the first search teams reached the perimeter. For the next 24 hours, they played a desperate game of cat and mouse with Morrison's forces. The broken lands provided cover, but they also made navigation treacherous. Jack's ankle, despite Meridian's treatment, was a constant source of pain, limiting their mobility. Several times they had to hide, pressed into narrow crevices or concealed beneath overhangs, while search teams passed within feet of their location. Morrison had committed significant resources to the hunt. Jack counted at least 50 personnel, along with dogs, drones, and sophisticated scanning equipment. But the broken lands had one advantage that technology couldn't easily overcome: the rock formations created sensor anomalies, false readings that sent search teams chasing phantom heat signatures and non-existent movement. The chaos of the geology worked in their favor, creating 1,000 places to hide and even more false trails to follow. During one period of enforced stillness, hiding in a cave while search teams worked the area outside, Meridian shared something that made Jack understand the true stakes of their situation. The alien showed him visions of what would happen if first contact between humans and Meridian's people went wrong. Projections based on careful study of human history and psychology. Jack saw potential futures where fear drove humanity to militarize, where the discovery of alien technology led to new weapons and new wars, where the knowledge that humanity wasn't alone in the universe triggered social and religious upheaval that tore civilizations apart. But Meridian also showed him other possibilities: futures where contact happened when humanity was ready, when wisdom had tempered fear, when curiosity had overcome the urge to dominate and control. In those visions, Jack saw humans and aliens working together, sharing knowledge, exploring the cosmos as partners rather than competitors or conquerors. He saw a future where humanity's creativity and passion combined with alien wisdom and technology to create something neither species could achieve alone. The message was clear. Timing mattered. Humanity needed more time to mature, to overcome its self-destructive tendencies, to prove it could be trusted with the knowledge that it wasn't alone. If Meridian was captured now, if humanity's first real contact came through an act of imprisonment and forced study, it would poison the relationship between species potentially forever. But if Meridian escaped, if this encounter remained a mystery, humanity could continue developing at its own pace until it was truly ready for the cosmos beyond its small planet. As the sun began to set on their final day, marking just 12 hours until the rescue ship would arrive, Jack and Meridian reached what Jack considered their best option: a complex of caves, deep in the heart of the broken lands. The caves were connected by passages too narrow for most adults, but Jack and the slender Meridian could navigate them. More importantly, the caves had multiple exits, giving them options if they were discovered. They settled in to wait, and for the first time in days, allowed themselves to rest fully. Jack's body ached from exhaustion, and his ankle throbbed, despite the pain medication he'd taken from his first aid kit. Meridian, while stronger than after the crash, showed signs of depletion from the constant stress and energy expenditure of healing Jack's injury. In the quiet of the cave, illuminated only by the soft bioluminescence of Meridian's skin, they talked not with words, but through the deep mental connection they developed. Jack asked questions he'd been wanting to explore. What was Meridian's world like? What did the alien think of humanity? What would happen after the rescue? Meridian painted pictures in Jack's mind of a world that seemed like something from a dream, cities that grew rather than were built, technology that worked with nature rather than dominating it, a species that had learned to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility. It wasn't a perfect utopia. Meridian's people had their own conflicts, their own struggles with difficult questions, that they had learned to address these challenges without destroying themselves or their world in the process. As for humanity, Meridian's perspective was nuanced. The alien saw humans as a species at a crossroads, possessing extraordinary potential for both greatness and destruction. Humans created art of stunning beauty while simultaneously developing weapons of horrifying power. They could show incredible compassion while also committing acts of terrible cruelty. They were brilliant and foolish, generous and selfish, capable of understanding the cosmos while often failing to understand themselves. In short, they were young not in years but in wisdom, still learning the hard lessons about how to survive as an intelligent species. And after the rescue, Meridian would return home, would report on what had happened, would add Jack's story to the long history of human-alien encounters that Meridians, as people had been documenting for generations. Jack's act of protection would be remembered, would become part of the evidence that humans, for all their flaws, possessed something worth preserving, the capacity for kindness to strangers, even strangers from other worlds. But there was something else, something Meridian showed Jack with careful hesitation. The alien had been authorized to offer Jack a choice. When the rescue ship arrived, if Jack wished, he could leave with Meridian. He could see the stars from beyond Earth, could experience other worlds, could learn from a civilization that had been exploring space while humans were still learning to control fire. It would mean leaving Earth, probably forever. The return journey would take years, and by the time Jack could come back, everyone he'd known would be long gone. The offer stunned Jack into silence. To see other worlds, to experience the cosmos beyond Earth's small corner, it was the dream of every explorer, every adventurer who'd ever looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. But it would also mean abandoning his home, his species, everything familiar. It would mean becoming what Meridian was now, a stranger in a strange land, always alien, always apart. Jack thought about his ranch, about the life he'd built in isolation. He thought about Sarah Mitchell's offer of friendship, about the human connections he'd denied himself for so long. He thought about the fact that he'd been given a second chance at connection with Meridian, and how that had transformed him. Could he really leave behind the possibility of finding that same transformation with his own kind? Before Jack could formulate an answer, their brief peace was shattered. Voices echoed through the cave system. Morrison's team had found the entrance. Jack and Meridian moved immediately, navigating toward one of the back exits through passages that required them to crawl and squeeze through tight spaces. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's voice, surprisingly close, calling out, "Mr. Thornton, we know you're in here. There's no way out that we haven't covered. Whatever you're protecting, whatever you found, we can handle this peacefully. Just come out and talk to me." Jack and Meridian pressed on, emerging from the exit into the cool night air of the Broken Lands. Above them, stars blazed in patterns Jack had known his entire life. The same stars humans had used for navigation and inspiration for millennia. And somewhere among those stars was Meridian's home, impossibly far away, yet suddenly feeling close enough to touch. They climbed, making their way to the highest point in the area, a flat-topped formation that rose above the surrounding chaos of broken rock. It was exposed, visible from all directions, but it was also the coordinates Meridian had given for the rescue ship's landing site. They had perhaps 30 minutes until the ship arrived, and Morrison's teams were closing in from multiple directions. As they waited on that exposed plateau, Jack made his decision about Meridian's offer. "I'm staying," he said aloud, the words carrying across the still desert air. "This is my world, my people, even if I've spent years hiding from them. You've shown me that connection matters, that isolation isn't protection, it's just another form of giving up. I need to take what I've learned from you and find a way to apply it here, with humans, with my own kind." Meridian's response came through their link understanding mixed with respect and a touch of sadness at the parting that was coming. The alien had known Jack would choose to stay. It was part of what made Jack who he was, part of what made him someone worth remembering across the stars. Flashlights appeared in the darkness below. Morrison's teams had found them. The agent himself emerged from the maze of rocks, flanked by a dozen men in tactical gear. He looked up at Jack and Meridian standing together on the plateau, and even from a distance, Jack could see the shock on Morrison's face as the agent got his first clear look at Meridian. "Mr. Thornton," Morrison called up, his voice tight with controlled excitement and underlying fear, "step away from it. Whatever it's told you, whatever you think you know, you're in over your head. This is a matter of national security, of planetary security. His name is Meridian," Jack called back, "and he's not in it. He's a person, just like you and me, from a place we can't even imagine. And he's going home." Morrison started to respond, but his words were cut off by a sound that made everyone freeze, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration that resonated in bones and teeth. The air above the plateau began to shimmer, and then, materializing out of nothing with technology that made human physics look primitive, a craft appeared. It was beautiful in its alienness, organic curves that seemed to flow rather than hold rigid angles, surfaces that shifted through colors like oil on water, a design that suggested it moved through space the way fish move through water. A section of the craft opened, and light spilled out, not harsh but welcoming, like sunlight through leaves. Meridian's hand found Jack's shoulder, a gesture of farewell that carried the weight of everything they'd shared. Through their link, Jack felt a final exchange of gratitude, respect, and the promise that he would be remembered, that this story would be told among the stars as an example of what humans could be at their best. Then Meridian was moving toward the craft, boarding with the fluid grace of someone returning home. The alien paused at the entrance, looking back at Jack one final time, and Jack felt rather than heard the final message. "Live well, my friend. Build the connections you've avoided. Show your people what you've shown me, that humans can choose wisdom over fear, compassion over control. You are capable of such greatness, if only you can learn to see it in yourselves." The craft sealed itself, rose silently into the air, and in the span of a heartbeat, accelerated to impossible speed and vanished among the stars, leaving no trace except the memory of its presence. For a long moment, everyone stood in silence. Morrison and his team staring at the empty sky where something impossible had just occurred. Jack standing alone on the plateau, feeling the absence of Meridian's mental presence like the loss of a limb. Morrison was the first to move, climbing up to the plateau with an expression that mixed awe, frustration, and grudging respect. "You let it go," he said simply. "You had access to technology beyond anything on Earth, to knowledge that could have changed everything, and you let it go." "I helped a friend get home," Jack corrected. "And maybe that's exactly what will change everything, not forcing contact before we're ready, but proving we're capable of compassion even when it costs us. Maybe someday, when we're ready, when we've learned to stop destroying ourselves and each other, Meridian's people will come back. And maybe they'll remember that once a human chose kindness over exploitation." Morrison studied Jack for a long time, then surprised him by nodding slowly. "You're going to be debriefed. Extensively. There will be reports, investigations, people who won't be happy with how this turned out. But between you and me?" He glanced up at the stars. "I hope you're right. I hope we get that second chance. And I hope we're smart enough not to waste it." The journey back to civilization was long, filled with questions Jack couldn't or wouldn't answer in detail. He was debriefed for weeks, always telling the same story, always protecting Meridian's secrets while sharing enough to satisfy curiosity without providing information that could be weaponized. Eventually, they let him go, returning him to his ranch with the understanding that he would be monitored, that his life would never be entirely his own again. But Jack found he didn't mind as much as he once would have. The isolation that had felt like sanctuary now felt like a cage. He started accepting Sarah Mitchell's invitations for coffee, started making the trip to Redemption Falls more often, started slowly building the human connections he denied himself for so long. It was hard, awkward, even years of isolation weren't overcome in days or weeks. But every time he was tempted to retreat, to hide behind his walls again, he remembered Meridian's message about humanity's potential, about the choice between wisdom and fear. On clear nights, Jack would sit on his porch and look up at the stars, wondering which one held Meridian's world, wondering if the alien ever looked up at their sky and thought about the cowboy who'd chosen to help a stranger. The mental connection was gone, severed by distance that human minds couldn't fully comprehend, but the impact remained. Jack had been changed by their encounter, had been shown a reflection of humanity that was both humbling and inspiring.